he's going to carry out the transformations that would make permanent revolution a reality in countries like Egypt and Tunisia.
Thank you. It's always wonderful to be at Marxism. We don't have anything quite like this in the United States, and I think it's our population is too small. I always give a title to my talks, and this one is called Ecology and Marxian Political Economy. And I wanted to talk about Marx and ecology, but I also wanted to talk about later developments in Marxism and ecology. And rather than trying to talk about all the scientific developments, I want to narrow it down to Marxian political economy and what it has to say about the ecological problem. The thesis of my talk, if there is one, is that the full enormity of the ecological crisis can only really be fully understood from a perspective that's informed by Marxism. And I'll try to explain why that is so. Scientists, of course, understand many aspects of the ecological crisis. The Green Movement does. But there are elements in Marxian political economy, in Marxism, that allow you to see more fully where the problem lies, namely capitalism. We'll return to that. We're really at an ecological moment of truth. We really don't have very many decades left if we want to prevent major ecological catastrophes. And even the scientists have been very difficult, have had a difficult time in estimating the full extent of the crisis. So every year that goes by, they find out that, well, there's a new problem that wasn't considered before, a new major crisis that we're facing in the ecological realm. Every year we find out that all of our calculations in terms of what was going to happen were too modest. Even our worst fears are surpassed. And I think that this is the nature of the ecological crisis. We have to understand why this is so. Why are they so bad at conceiving this crisis and its scope and range? In order to talk about this, I want to talk about two stages of ecological critique of capitalism. One in the 19th century, represented by Marx's own critique, which I think is fundamental, provides us with the foundations. And then I want to look at the kinds of ecological critiques that were being developed in the 20th century, and particularly in the late 20th century, as a result of Marxian political economy, and show you that some of these arguments, some of the analysis from the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and up to the present are absolutely vital in order to understand the ecological crisis we're facing. So because of this, I'm not going to talk about Marx as much as I commonly have at this conference. I'm going to go over some things very quickly, but there are things that we've talked a lot about in the past and that are in my books and the works of other people working on Marxist ecology. So I think that we can go through some things fairly quickly now in order to get at what we need to know about the present. Because we can't understand the ecological crisis even on the level of looking at capitalism. We have to look more historically, in a more historically specific way, at the kind of capitalism in which we are living today. And particularly monopoly capitalism or whatever name you want to give it, but it has to be specifically understood in terms of contradictions that are coming about today. First of all, in terms of Marx's viewpoint, Marx wrote in the German ideology that men's restricted attitude to nature determines their restricted relation to one another. And their restricted relation to one another determines their restricted attitude to nature. What he was saying is it's a very dialectical relationship that the focus on the exploitation of nature and building a whole society on the most rapid and massive exploitation of nature possible goes hand in hand with the exploitation of human beings, with social class and other forms of social exploitation. And those forms of exploitation depend on our exploitation of nature. So we have to deal with both of these problems simultaneously if we're going to solve the problem. Marx, as many of you will know by now, wrote his, they used to say Marx didn't write anything on nature. He wrote his dissertation on philosophy of nature, on the ancient Greek philosophy of nature, particularly the ancient Greek materialists, Democritus, and Epicurus. In fact, he focused on the work of Epicurus. And there are many aspects of Epicurean materialism that are deeply ecological. It's also the foundation of all materialist thought, of a materialist conception of nature. For example, in Epicurus, you have what we call the principle of population. Nothing comes from nothing, and nothing being destroyed turns into nothing. Epicurus liked to talk in paradoxes. But what you have there is a philosophy that fits well with the first and second laws of thermodynamics. And Epicurean philosophy was very materialist, very anti-affluence, anti-accumulation, very due to friendship with nature, as Marx put it, as well as human friendship and community. So Marx took a lot of ideas, a lot of insights from Epicurean materialism, and of course developed them in a different way. And this was the beginning of a lifelong interest in science that pervades Marx's works. We know him mostly as a social scientist, but he didn't really respect those boundaries. He worked in science as well, studied science, built it into his analysis at every point where it was necessary. And for this reason, his work, his critique of capitalism, ends up being very ecologically concerned at every stage. In the economic and philosophical manuscripts, he's already talking about the pollution of the cities. He's talking about industrial pollution. He's saying that human beings are a part of nature, and he talks about the alienation from nature as a contradiction of capitalism. So this is very deeply embedded in his thought and goes through all of his work. In Capital itself, well, actually it begins with Marx's, when he was editor of Bellamy, when he first turned to political economy, it was in the context of discussing the theft of wood in the German forest. Most of the individuals in prison in Prussia at the time, in the Rhineland, were there for taking dead wood out of the forest. That is, picking up dead wood, not for cutting down trees, but for picking up dead wood on the lands and using it to warm their homes. And it gets cold in Germany in the winter, and to cook and so on. And these were common rights, and this had previously been common land, but instead they were being treated as they were breaking the law at that point, and they were being put into prison. And there was a debate in Parliament about it. As to the debate was whether whether the law should protect the large landowners or it should protect the small landowners. And Marx went to Parliament and wrote an analysis of this. But he was very concerned from the very beginning with the destruction of common lands and primitive accumulation. And if you look at the economic and philosophical manuscripts, the part that nobody reads, the beginning parts on the rent of land, it's all about primitive accumulation already in the 1840s. So he started with those kinds of issues. And of course, he went on and developed his political economy. And as time goes on, his political economy becomes more ecologically rich. And I'm just going to mention a few things. One of the things that, of course, Marx built into his political economy was the contradiction between use value and exchange value. He considered this to be one of the fundamental elements of political economy, and I'm sure you all know that, and I can't go into all the ramifications of that, but as it's crucial to understand the ecological contradictions of capitalism as Marx perceived them. For example, Lord Lauderdale, who was a contemporary of Adam Smith, developed what was called the Lauderdale paradox. Lauderdale was I suppose some of you know about Lauderdale's history. He was actually in the French Revolution. He was one of these aristocrats who was sort of red Tory and actually got involved in the French Revolution. And he wrote all these notes on Adam Smith. But he was obviously a Tory, but he had very critical analyses of political economy at the time, and in some ways he was connected to Malthus, but in some ways he was a very critical thinker. And what he's most famous for is what is known as the Lauderdale paradox, and which was the centerpiece of his work on political economy. And Lauderdale argued that he was basing it on the use value exchange value distinction, and he said that under this system you promote private riches by destroying public wealth. And it had to do with the whole critique of wealth. Wealth, he said, was related to use value, not exchange value. And riches were related to exchange value. And so Lauderdale argued that in what the system, what we call capitalism, was doing was destroying use values such as water and air. And he used the destruction of water, the privatization of water as an example. It was destroying resources and turning and their use value in order to create scarcity, which made them into commodities, which could then be monopolized, and you could make private riches out of it. So capitalism actually promoted scarcity. And this was something that Ricardo actually took on, and Marx took on. And it's fundamental to understand even today the nature of the ecological contradictions. And but Marx's most important contribution, and it was of the theory of the metabolic rift, which again I think a lot of you know about by now. He was very influenced by Liebig, Justus von Liebig's work on agriculture and on the soil, and how the main sources of soil fertility, the main nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, were being taken from the soil in the form of food and fiber and shipped hundreds and thousands of miles to the cities, where they entered into human consumption and then ended up in waste in the cities, in pollution in the cities, and instead of returning to the soil. Liebig had this conception that British industrial agriculture, what they called high farming, did this at a very systematic level, and he called it a robbery system, or Rabau, and Marx was very influenced by this, but he developed this this notion of metabolic rift into a deeper, more ecological critique of capitalism and integrating class and his general political economic outlook. So Marx took it much further. I guess you're not taught about this part of Liebig in Britain, because when Liebig wrote his most scathing indictment of British agriculture, it was a 100-page introduction to his most famous work. And the British had always translated his works, but instead they threw it in the fire. They decided they wouldn't translate it because he was criticizing British agriculture too much. But Marx used this analysis and took it and made it social, made it into part of his critique of capitalism. And I can't go into all aspects of this, but he talked about a rift between human beings and nature that developed as a result of this, an irreparable rift within the context of the system. You couldn't solve this. And it had to do with also capitalism's separation of city and country. And he argued that there had to be a restoration of the metabolism between human beings and nature. But this restoration could only occur under a society of associated producers. And he argued that he developed on the basis of concepts of sustainability. Probably the most radical conceptions of sustainability we've ever seen came out of Marx in this context, because he argued that no one owns the land, no one owns the earth. He said that not even all the nations on earth, not even all the people on earth own the land, that we only hold it in trust for future generations. There's never been a more radical conception of sustainability than this. And you have to understand, Marx taught his whole notion of metabolism to labor, so to labor and production. So he defines the labor and production process as literally the metabolic relation between human beings and nature. So the very alienation of production is the metabolic rift, is the alienation of nature. They all go hand in hand in this system for him. And the solution requires a society of associated producers, which, as he says, can rationally regulate the relation between human beings and nature, the metabolism between human beings and nature, and by controlling social production. And actually, that's Marx's most concrete and famous definition of socialism, although people have often missed the ecological dimension of it. So Marx developed all of this and much more because he dealt with, he referred to just about all of the ecological problems of his time. He talked about the squandering, or Engels and Marx did, the squandering of fossil fuels, of coal and other resources. They talked about deforestation, they talked about desertification, they even talked about climate change, although they were talking more about microclimates, and they talked about they dealt with thermodynamics. They introduced energy into the analysis of the production process and basic thermodynamic concepts. So it was very sophisticated, and Marx already had barriers and boundaries dialectic, where he said that capitalism will not accept any boundaries. It treats them all as barriers to be overcome. And he related this to economic and expansion vis-a-vis nature. Marx talked about the need of the system to constantly expand the circle of consumption and the contradictions with this, and so on. There are various ways in which that almost all the foundations of an ecological critique of capitalism are already in Marx, and not really to be found anywhere else in the 19th century and and early 20th century. You have, in terms of the social dimensions of it, this is as far as anyone got. Even I argue that Engels had, and Marx had a notion that you could call the concept of the environmental proletariat. If you go back to Engels' Condition of the English Working Class, he's talking about the industrial proletariat. Most of his discussion is about their living conditions in the cities, the environmental pollution, the effects on their health. It's almost all environmental, which is actually the working class saw things in those terms. They didn't see it as just what went on in the factory. Of course, that was important. And then he had the agricultural proletariat and the mining proletariat, and he deals with them in similar terms. The narrowing down of the concept of the proletariat to just blue-collar factory workers is something that goes against the classical tradition in Marx's theory. So, but what does Marxism in more recent times have to add to this? And I mean, we have the basis of an ecological critique of capitalism that helps us to understand what the problem is. You could also look at Marx's notions of how accumulation is Moses of the prophets, and that the accumulation drive, the treadmill of production of the system. You can see how destructive the system is ecologically by looking at it in these terms of Marx. But I think that other thinkers later on in the 20th century began to see further elements of ecological destruction, other political economic thinkers that were either Marxists or influenced heavily by Marx. And we actually have the basis for further development of Marxist ecological vision. And I want to mention in this context, particularly theorists who were dealing with the issue of monopoly capitalism, particularly Thorstein Veblen in the United States, who was writing about monopoly capitalism about the same time as Hilferding, but was in many ways more advanced, and particularly in the ecological realm. And I want to talk about Paul Baran and Paul Sweezy's arguments in Monopoly Capital, Alan Schneebert's work in the environment, but also a host of other thinkers who were related to these and overlapping with some of them radical liberal Marxist anarchist thinkers who understood, particularly in the 60s through the early 80s, how ecologically destructive capitalism was in terms of its political economy, why the political economy undermined the environment. And then when the ecological movement developed further, one of the problems was that Marxian political economy weakened for a while, and the connection between the political economic critique and the ecological critique was lost. And I think this is absolutely vital. So I want to say some things about this. And I'll start with Veblen, Thorstein Veblen, and his most important ecological work is Absentee Ownership, which was his final book, written in 1923. And I can't tell you all the things that were in there, but the ecological analysis is fundamental. Of course, Veblen is most famous for the idea that he introduced in the theory of the leisure class, conspicuous consumption. And that's really about consumption of positional goods, so that consumption being accelerated because it's associated with status, with you consume more because you want to prove that you're in a higher economic status than higher class or status position than other individuals, so that goods are consumed conspicuously as positional goods. But in Absentee Ownership, he developed other ideas, other critiques. And he dealt with oil as the new gold and the contradictions of that. dealt with what he called the American plan of resource exploitation, which was to cut down all the forests as fast as you could and turn them into money. He dealt with, I think his most important ecological ideas had to do with the way in which he related issues of conservation and environmentalism to the waste of resources. He talked about how the economy dominated by the giant firm was geared to larger and larger levels of economic waste, and that it had to promote consumption at higher and higher levels. So he talked about the growth of salesmanship, which didn't exist in the 19th century. And he talked about the penetration of the sales effort. Actually, these are words of Bryan and Sweezy, but the idea was Veblen's. The penetration of the sales effort into production, so that it's no longer, what we produce is no longer rational to the great degree it was in the past. That a very large part of the costs of production of anything we buy have to do with selling the good, and not with satisfying human needs or with the requirements of production itself. And he talked about how this waste in business and waste in production was increasingly inflated in the system. This is what we have to understand. This takes us back to the use value and exchange value problem. Marx talked about the contradiction in use value and exchange value, and even about how use values, which were associated with nature and production in general, were destroyed in order to promote exchange value, which is private riches. But what Marx never really discussed was the fact that under monopoly capitalism, and you see this in Bryan and Sweezy's work as well, that they begin to promote specifically capitalist use values, that they begin to produce products that have no real use for human beings, or that do very little to satisfy core needs, basic needs, even secondary needs. That increasingly we have waste built into the production process. The use values are in many ways irrational. Think of the packaging you buy when you buy a product, and oftentimes the packaging is the major part of the price of the product, and the major part of the resources used in producing the product. And why is the packaging there? It's there to sell the product. And this affects every aspect of production, so that we have to understand that a very large part of our production is completely wasteful and irrational, and Veblen provides the basis for that. Paul Brand and Paul Sweezy developed this further in Monopoly Capital, talking about how the system of concentrated capital it's very, very productive. It produces huge surpluses. Think about it today. In the United States, the corporations are sitting on $1 trillion of cash they don't know what to deal with. They don't know what to do with. They can't invest it because there aren't the profitable markets there now, and so they're just sitting on the cash. The system produces enormous surpluses at the top, and particularly in the large corporations. And then they have to find a way to develop the markets of one kind or another in order to absorb this surplus. And waste becomes built into the system. Product obsolescence becomes rational. The products are made to break down as soon as possible, whatever the consumers will accept. And people are taught to get rid of products before they break down. Psychological obsolescence is promoted through the marketing system. And so an enormous expansion of the sales effort, not to mention other forms of waste like military spending, and I'm sure you can think of vast amounts of waste in our society. The production system is irrational. Use value has been corrupted. We produce some products now, many, many products, that have no real use value that only exists because they promote exchange value for the capitalist, and because people can't be duped into buying them. And unless you understand how irrational the production system is, you can't understand why we're destroying the environment so rapidly and so unnecessarily from a socialist standpoint. But for capitalism, there's no alternative. Michael Cadron in 1970 in his Capitalism and Theory said that 60% of production was waste, and he provided a wonderful table of this. But I mean, it's clear that almost any product that you buy now is primarily waste and only partly related to any kind of satisfaction of basic needs or rational resource use. And this has to do with the fact that we don't have what they say we have, consumer sovereignty. We have what John Kenneth Galbraith famously called a dependence effect. What we consume depends on the production system, on how things are produced, on things are determined at the level of production by those who control the means of production, and not by the consumers who are also, the vast number of consumers who are also the workers. So this whole problem of use values is critical of understanding the ecological problem in monopoly capitalism and the speed with which we're destroying the environment. Joan Robinson called it the second crisis of economic theory. She said we'd solved the problem of jobs. She was wrong about that. But she said, but we still have a problem. She says we have to deal with what we produce, and not simply with the scale of output. And that problem still remains. What we're doing is producing more and more garbage. If you look at the Heather Rogers had some estimates in a recent book where she said that 80% of everything produced, bought in the United States, it turns into rubbish within a year, well, actually almost at once, and that the amount of garbage has produced by U.S. society, the amount of rubbish has increased, has doubled in the last 30 years. Most of the waste is actually in the production process. Remember what I said, waste in the production process. If you had, suppose you decided that, well, everybody in the United States or in England has a certain amount of waste in their household. And if we looked at the per capita average amount of waste in the households, and then each household would have a certain amount of waste that they were responsible to their share of the total waste in society, let's say. And if you completely eliminated that, your per capita share of waste, so you had absolutely no garbage, no waste coming out of your household, you would eliminate 2%. You would have eliminated 2% of the waste, the total waste associated with you as an individual. Well, let me put it another way, because if everybody, all consumers in the United States eliminated all of their household waste, so that there's no waste coming out from any household in the United States, there would still be 98% of the waste would still be there, because the other 98% comes from industry. And you'd have to be crazy to think that this is an efficient system. And all that waste, and what are they producing with it? And it's like William Morris said, we're working ourselves to death, useless toil to produce useless goods. And he talked about that at the very end of the 19th century, and he could have never imagined what capitalism looks like today. And so you have these very, very serious problems. Alan Schneeberg, who's wrote a book called The Environment in 1980, he's considered one of the founders of environmental sociology in the United States. He based his whole ecological critique, which was called the treadmill of production theory. He rooted it in Marx and Veblen and Baran and Sweezy and Galbraith and other thinkers who were very closely related to this at the time, coming out of the scientific community, like Barry Commoner and Murray Bookchin and so on. And he argued that the fallacy of mainstream environmentalism was to think that you could solve the environmental problem by changing consumption, getting people to change their consumption, reduce their consumption, or by changing technology, coming up with better environmental technology. The problem is that they'll always tell you now that we need to have green technology. Green technology is going to save us. Well, if people hadn't forgotten so much in the way of these critiques, they might recognize that the technology that we've got is a technology created by capitalism, and it is the technology that is necessary for the promotion of monopoly capitalism in particular. That is, we have a labor-saving, energy-intensive technology, as Schneeberg emphasized. And that is part of the environmental regime. They're not going to get away from that. The system maximizes the throughput of energy and resources. And why does it do that? Because by doing that, it can cut back on labor and thereby reduce wages and increase profit margins. The energy intensity is the main strategy of profit maximization. It's integral to the whole process of creating a global reserve army. It's integral to the process of profit maximization and accumulation. So the environmental regime is built into the system at this point. And the same with the consumption. You can't create sustainable consumption when in the United States in 2005, I think it was 2006, the United States spent $1 trillion on marketing. That is $1 trillion convincing people to buy things. The whole object of marketing is to get people to buy things. You think the U.S. military is big? Well, the marketing apparatus in the United States is as big or as bigger than the U.S. military, which tries to control the entire world. And this is in order, and then environmentalists go out and they tell people, we've got to be a green consumer. Well, how can you be a green consumer when you have marketing apparatus of $1 trillion pushing you in that direction? So the whole thing is completely irrational. And when you look at Marx's famous formula, his famous general formula for capital, MCM prime, I think you all know about this, and some environmentalists have even taken on, like Herman Daly uses Marx's famous general formula of capital to explain the need for, under capitalism, for this system to grow, and the irrationality of that from an ecological perspective, because the way the general formula of capital works under capitalism is you start with money, you buy a commodity, and then you convert that to more money in the end, with a profit. They try to pretend that the formula of exchange and production is actually starting with a commodity, using money to buy that, and ending up with another commodity at the end, which would be a sustainable system. What Marx called simple commodity production. And in the economic textbooks, they pretend that that's the way the system works, but it doesn't. The beginning and end of the process is money. And then when you get M prime at the end of 1 year, then you take that and reinvest that so that you'll get M prime at the end of the M double prime at the end of the next year, and M triple prime at the end of the following year, and so on. The whole idea is to accumulate, to expand the scale of production. It's built into capitalism. And so we understand this, and people always talk about the scale effects and the limits to growth. Even the green theorists understand this now. But one thing that they don't understand is they don't understand is how in this process of MCM prime, C, consumption has been transformed. The technology and the consumption have been transformed. So they're less and less rational. The use value basis of the system is turning into the production of waste as the primary goal of the system in order to keep it going. And as you get to a system of monopoly finance capital, where more and more we move from production to an emphasis on production to an emphasis on speculation, these irrationalities go to another level. I think that we need this kind of critique now, and I know it's very hard for you to understand and for me to explain this much in a single 45-minute talk, but I think we need this understanding of monopoly capitalism and ecological destruction beyond the fundamental Marxist concepts of the metabolic rift and so on. The metabolic rift is much worse because we're producing all of these synthetic goods. We're producing enormous amounts of plastics and petrochemical goods and what Barry Commoner called the synthetic age. And most of it is tied to a kind of hyper-commercialism. And most of it is further and further removed from human needs. And most of the ecologists now are saying capitalism, and the green thinkers are increasingly buying into capitalism and saying capitalism can save the environment. We can find ways in which to keep this system going. And we can find the energy sources and the forms of efficiency will keep this system going. Well, you have to be absolutely insane to think that keeping this kind of system going could in any way could be compatible with protection of the environment. And just one last point in that respect, climate change is a problem that capitalism can't deal with. Sometimes they'll come up with these notions, oh, we have the technologies, the carbon trading systems and so on to solve climate change, but the system simply can't do it. The only way you can deal with that problem is to move away from the main tendencies of capitalism. You have to protect use values, and you have to curtail needless production. And capitalism can't possibly deal with these issues. And of course, climate change is so disastrous. Just think of the sea level rise, the droughts, the extreme weather events, the deforestation, the loss of crops. We're really facing cataclysm in this respect. But climate change is actually only a small part of the global ecological crisis. Scientists now talk about 9 planetary rifts, including, I can go into the others, ocean acidification, the change in land use, the nitrogen and phosphorus problem, and so on. And the water shortages, and each one of these is a global environmental catastrophe in the making. Each one of them would destroy the planet as we know it. Species extinction, which is now they argue about whether we're going to kill off 40 or 50% of all species this century. And so these problems are immense. There's no way this kind of system can deal with it. And what the green theorists generally don't want to talk about, although I'm very sympathetic with the ecological theorists generally, but most green theorists are naive and say we can solve these problems with just technology and just consumption, but we don't have to address the relations of production. We don't have to address the system itself. And this ought to be clear. There is no way we can avert this disaster but by transforming the relations of production fundamentally. There is no other answer, and Marxists can at least understand why this problem is not only getting worse, but it's getting worse faster, because it's tied to the whole accumulation dynamic of the system.